Anyway, welcome back. And as Kathy said when she first came on, these chapters are amazing. There's so much in there. Of course, Sarah's here. John Gibson from Clayton couldn't be here today. He had a family thing come up. The video of last week's session, if you want to go back and show it to somebody or just review, is at Grace Clayton's Facebook page. You go and look under the groups, and there's a group called Faith Meets Reason, and it's on that. I just haven't had a chance to put it on Trinities, but that's in the plan. And we are recording this as we go on. I think everybody remembers our introduction of Bishop Curry. And I think the most important part of that, even though there's a lot of interesting things with his connections to North Carolina and the fact he's been to Trinity and Grace and all those churches, is that his emphasis throughout his ministry, and particularly during his time as presiding bishop, has been to focus, I would say, to focus on love, to encourage the church to be walking with, standing with those people in need. And need didn't just refer to physical things like food and housing or medical care, but also the more sociological things like racial reconciliation and things like that. And if you recall, his whole point in those first 3 chapters, well, there were lots of points, but his major one was that love is a verb. Love is action. Love is what we do, not what we feel. That, for me anyway, when I first heard it years ago, was a major, major change in my thinking. He does give lots of examples of his life through those first 3 chapters, and now he basically was setting a foundation in those first 3 chapters, and now he turns to some extent to what it means to apply it in our lives. He actually does more of that later in the book, but if you want to say, he's bringing it from the broad and general down to the more personal. I will go ahead and announce some page numbers, but we're going to be flying. So if later on, if you'd like a copy of my notes, feel free to just message me and I'd be happy to send them to you. Back in the first 3 chapters, in chapter 2, he talked about how important it is to have a dream. And in chapter 3, he suggested, and I love this phrase, that we are to live between reality and fantasy. We are to live in that in-between place, being aware of reality while having that dream, that fantasy of what things really should be. And he stresses that God has and you can vary the word, a dream, a vision, an intention, not just for this world in broad, but for each of us individually, and that our goal is to seek to live into God's dream. On page 74, he states that the only people who have changed the world for the better are people who dare to live into the dream of change. And certainly that applies to our personal lives too. So then moving on in next chapter, starting on page 78, Curry gets really practical, and he has several very practical comments as we go through. He begins again talking about acting in the best interest of other people. And boy, he then throws one of the major curveballs or fastballs or whatever at us when he said that might, could, and maybe should include politics. That should impact politics. Now, he doesn't go into anything specific, but he raises what, for me anyway, is a very important, a very difficult, and a very timely issue. How should our Christian faith impact politics? On the next page, 79, he wrote that to be a person of faith is one who asks, why not? Now, I wrote in the margin there that the question we all have is, will love work in the real world? He quoted Verna Dozier, and if you don't know Verna Dozier, she's a wonderful, wonderful author, a layperson in the Episcopal Church. She has since died. but if you ever see a book by her, you will be impacted by it and enjoy it. Vernon Dozier says institutional religion was much less important than an individual's commitment to living out the teachings of Jesus Christ. Let me go over that again. Institutional religion, churches, much less important than an individual's commitment to live out the teachings of Jesus Christ. And I think Curry and Dozier would agree that where they're going with this is that it is the church's role to help people live out those teachings. Then on page 86, he has a subheading that I just, it says, he says, how to change a negative into a positive. How to change a negative into a positive. What a challenging proposition. And he answers a question somebody asked him along those lines by saying, not only will love work to change our world, it is the only thing that will work. Furthermore, it will only work when we live into it, not pretending, but honestly doing. Then he ends that chapter with the 10 Commandments of nonviolence. And number 2 was the one that really leapt out at me. It says, remember always that the goal is justice and reconciliation, not victory. And that took me a couple minutes to think through, but a victory, when we're focused on winning in that sense, it allows for and maybe even requires violence to the other side. Justice and reconciliation, love, does not allow harm to anyone. Now, that said, let me just stress, this is not about, and never should be about, allowing yourself to be abused. There's a big difference between treating the other person well and allowing yourself to be abused. And he actually gets into that in the next chapter. And all that leads directly to chapter 5, which he subtitles, Won't loving everyone make me a doormat? Should I keep toxic or abusive people in my life at the expense of my well-being? And you know, your first reaction, at least my first reaction to that was, oh, I know the answer. Obviously, the answer is no. But what Curry does, I think, is really fascinating. He flips that question right upside down and approaches it from a different direction. He discusses how important it is to have balance, to learn the balance between caring for ourselves and caring for others. Although now I think about it, I think he phrased it the other way around, caring for others and caring for ourselves. Again, making sure that what we're doing is not allowing ourselves to be doormats or to be abused. Then on page 104, Bishop Curry makes a point I've been commenting on for a while, particularly concerning what's going on in our society over the last, take a number, 6, 8, 10 years particularly. And you take your pick on the topic because it applies to many. He says, changing laws is important, but the real progress, the real moment of stepping into God's dream comes when you change hearts. That is, new rules may be important to protect people, but they do not change the culture which generates the problem. And the Jim Crow laws after the Civil War and the rebuilding after the Civil War, we thought we had passed all these the constitutional amendment and all these laws. Evil found a way past them, past the rules. Evil will always find a way past the rules. It's only a change in hearts that goes on in any kind of extended time period. On page 109, there's a short, I won't get into it, but there's a short kind of interesting comment about the royal wedding. One of those in the middle of some heavy stuff, you get to chuckle out loud. Curry is talking about important changes in our lives and to our world, and he summarizes where we're trying to go on page 111. He talks about developing a solution that's better for everyone. Developing a solution that's better for everyone. And go back to what he had said earlier about justice and reconciliation does not allow harm to other people, does not allow other people to be put at a disadvantage. It has to work for everyone. And along those lines, in several places, he talks about how developing such a solution has to begin by sincerely listening to other people. Now, that includes people we disagree with. It includes people we agree with, trying to understand them, but the group we may sometimes not think about is the people we think we understand. The people we think we understand. Lots of times we think so, but we don't, and we need to listen to them. Then in chapter 6, he subtitles, I'm just a regular person. Can my love have an impact? And I guess you know his answer is a resounding yes. But he quickly moves from that, and I think this is wonderful. He talked about practicality. He moves from saying, oh, yes, to setting reasonable expectations. Work like the world, the future of the world depends on you, and it does, but do not be all surprised when you do not change the world. And that's my phrase, my summary of what he said, not his words. We might simply be planting seeds, but we may never see them bloom. But if we don't plant the seeds, nothing can bloom. Frederick Douglass, if there's no struggle, there is no progress. Athletes phrase it, no pain, no gain. Same point. And then on page 122, he continues this. He says, we cannot know where our witness will lead, where our witness to love will lead, our act of love. And he warns us again against getting frustrated and possibly stopping out of frustration because we try to do more than our job. We try to be God. We try to be in control of the end result. And that's just not going to work. Now, of course, the danger to being practical and reasonable in your expectations is we can use that as an excuse to do less. I mean, if I'm not going to change the world, why should I try type of attitude. It's about doing more than we think possible while leaving the result to God. And on page 135, he continues, and his subtitle here is, our job is to do our job. Again, not God's. And his practicality, his awareness of what happens in real life really comes through in this book. On page 136, he writes, the nature of existence is that you can get knocked back. You weep, you fuss, you cuss, and you learn from it. Then you get up and go forward again. A little while later, if I let God be God and I do my job in God's program, that's enough. And he concludes the passage, the paragraph, with a great image. We can all plant seeds, though only some of us may be lucky enough to sit in their shade. Then on beginning chapter 7, he poses a question that I suspect, we think, okay, this is basic. We know the answer to this. And the question, I'm told to love my neighbor, but who is my neighbor? But again, he does something interesting with this. He loops back to the question of what it means to be a loving person in the context of our society. On page 143, he states, it's easy for us as individuals to be a moral personality, but at the same time be immoral as part of our society, class, race, or religion. There's a prayer in the Episcopal prayer book. It's part of one of the confessions that just hits me hard every time we use it. And what it does is includes asking forgiveness for things done in our name. I shudder. I mean, we can think of examples of that with government, I'm sure. We can say, oh, the government shouldn't have done that. But we need to bring it closer to home. So as an example, if I behave in a moral, loving manner, but the swim club my family joins actively discourages blacks from entering, doesn't that say something about me? Even if I'm not on the board, even if I can say I personally have done nothing wrong, but nothing at all but jump in the pool, isn't it true that evil is being done in my name? Or even a more current example, if we live in a town, and when I used this one this morning, all the teachers started nodding. If I live in a town where one school gets substantially more money and resources than another school, isn't evil being done in my name? And Curry takes those kind of things and he suggests that they happen when we allow other people to become an to become an item rather than a person. Not a real person in our sight, but just something else. Think of that school example again. If we know a few of the kids in that other school, their lack of resources is really going to feel as a major issue. But if those kids in the other school are just faceless students, not anybody we know, not people, we're likely to have a very different attitude. So what he says on page 144 is the key is we need to pause deliberately and give ourselves time to notice. And I'll use an example from my life there, a real story. And that's many years ago, I was walking with a friend in downtown Winston-Salem at lunchtime. And as we're walking up the street, I just took a particularly long stride and kept on walking. Now, to understand this, you have to know I grew up in and around New York City. In New York City, particularly back then, stepping over a homeless person was just something you did. You didn't even notice. Well, that's what I had done. I had stepped over a man lying on the sidewalk and had not seen him. I was not even aware in a conscious manner that he existed. He was simply an obstacle for me to step over. Well, fortunately, my friend noticed him. We helped the man. But as we were doing that, I realized that at least a couple hundred people had done the same thing I did. I just walked past them without paying a whole lot of attention. They, not being from New York City, probably most of them saw him, but they made no attempt to help. And as I read this book, I was thinking back on that, and I began to wonder, did my friend's actions serve as a witness to love in such a way that another person's life was changed? Well, it certainly changed mine. But to go back to Curry's earlier images, did my friend's actions plant the seed that later blossomed in somebody's life? Now, he mentions that one challenge we face in trying to notice is the language we use and the language used at us. So I'm gonna mention a few things. I want you to just pause and notice what image comes to mind, just leaps into your mind. Welfare queen, homeless, illegal immigrant. And think about how that immediate reaction has been instilled in you by culture. And it depends, the wording can have a real impact. the same individual might be called an illegal immigrant or an undocumented. How very different. They're both accurate descriptions, but how very, very different the impression we get from those two titles. Or imagine again, you're walking down the street next, particularly the women, and it's night, and three young men come strutting towards you on the street. What's your immediate reaction? And there's nothing wrong with staying safe. I'm not suggesting that at all. But think about our immediate reaction. Or another one I've used is, imagine two young men coming towards you, and one is black, one is white, and the person standing next to you just says, oh, here comes the captain of the basketball team and the captain of the math club. Which one would you assume automatically is which? I know which one I would assume automatically is which. Impressions we've been had put on our head. And the important thing about that, Curry says, is to remember the individual is important because God says they are. Their actions might be totally against God's desires, God's dream for them. But everyone is God's somebody. Churches over history go through cycles of slogans. You probably remember, what would Jesus do? That got used over and over again. Well, many years before that, there was another one that just summarizes what Curry's saying here. It was, God doesn't make junk. God doesn't make junk. And we're all God's creation, and all those other people we see are one of God's creations. All right, the next thing I want to point out, I think he's wrong about. He's quoting William Temple, who was an archbishop, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Archbishop of Canterbury famously said, the church is the only society that doesn't exist for the good of its own members. Doesn't exist for the good of its own members. Well, I want to suggest to you that's wrong. The church should be the only society that doesn't exist for the good of its own members. But too many churches don't live up to that. Now, understand, I'm at neither Grace nor Trinity, but I've worked with both, and I'm very impressed by both of you and how well you try very hard to focus on people outside. So that's wonderful. And I don't want to say Grace and Trinity are the exception, but let me say they aren't the norm. And I say that with a great deal of pain. In fact, Curry goes on, and this is one of those, when he was elected bishop, when he was first interviewed, one of the things that impressed a lot of the clergy, myself included, was that he had been a rector in charge of several different churches of different sizes and different circumstances. He knew what real life was about. And he says on page 149, all human communities have demons. I'm not going to take that any further, but you can read that. Page 149. Starting there and through 155, he has a long example of a couple community efforts he was involved with, the summary of which, and he's coming back to the same point, even when we do it, it doesn't seem like somebody is listening, or it may not seem like somebody is listening. And let me make a suggestion. He just kind of alludes to this, but I'll expand on it. The next time you see a post on social media, either controversial or even non-controversial, that seems to be getting a lot of responses, notice how many people comment versus how many just read it and read the comments. And there's a good chance it'll be 10 to 1. For every comment, 10 other people are just watching it. And think about what that means about what we're talking about. The people who are most likely to be influenced in a circumstance are not those talking. The people who are writing or speaking their opinions are people who are going to find it hard to change those opinions because they're out there and they're not about to say they're wrong. But the people standing alongside listening are the people who can be influenced by what we say. And this is hard. It's hard for me because sometimes the challenge to a loving, active Christian is to speak up when we desperately don't want to. Now, my strategy there is to have a few phrases in the back of my head that I can grab and use in almost any circumstance. And, you know, one of them is, I believe. If you start, I believe, not I know, that changes the tone quite a bit. Of course, what I really want to say is, I believe you're a complete idiot, but you probably don't want to say that. But rather, if you're approaching it as a Christian, it's certainly possible to say, I believe what Jesus would want us to do is. Think about how that changes the tone. There's a very good chance the reaction you'll get is somebody go, ah, and leave the conversation. But it will bring to mind what you're trying to say to those people who are just listening. All right, well, if all of this did not challenge you enough, I invite you to look ahead to chapter 8. What if love reveals me to be a hypocrite? And my note in the margin is, oh yeah, it certainly does. So anyway, why don't we unmute and we'll just stay together for conversation. Let Sarah unmute then, and then who would like to jump in and comment? Welcome back, Ginger.
I've been here. I just cut it off so I can.
I know. Thoughts? This is pretty powerful stuff. Kathy, you mentioned early on how powerful it was. Anything in particular?
Yes, there were several things in particular. I didn't take notes, but there were several stories that he told that really made me see the love in his heart. And I've met him, I've heard him, but the story about the fire at St. James in Baltimore and the little boy, the people asking him, will St. James move? You know, the people were fleeing from the inner city, as was the way. And he saw this little boy, I think his name was Robbie, and Bishop Curry looked at him and he said, no, we can't move. He saw the need for the church in that community. And I think that was in the chapter titled Leave No One Behind, or No One Left Behind, or something like that. The other story that touched my heart deeply was when he, and I can't remember what chapter or page, but it was when he was in a group and there was a Holocaust survivor, an old woman, and he did not realize, but when she held up her hand, her sleeve fell down a little bit and he saw her tattoo. And that made a huge impression upon him. And it does to me too. I have family members that are Jewish, and my best friend from high school was Jewish. And so the Holocaust, I cannot even imagine that, but of course I'm not old enough to remember that. I've only read of it. But those are two things that struck me. And then the one thing that you said, I I heard something on the news tonight. You were mentioning on page 104 about changing hearts. Dagnabbit, I can't find it right now.
Changing
Oh,
laws.
the
is
changing
more
laws
important.
is important?
Yes, changing laws is important, but changing hearts is where it is.
Yeah, it's on 104 about 3/4 of the way down.
Okay. Well, tonight on the news, just this evening, I heard about you know, how there's a lot of Asian
Yeah.
hate or disruption in our country because of COVID, or I don't know why, but there is. And there are several counties that are enforcing laws or bringing in, they're going to do sensitivity training and this kind of thing. And I thought, well, until you change those hearts, it's not going to happen. And I just shook my head as I made my bed.
I love that.
Yes.
Shook my head as funny on the other. I love that.
And I think part of what we're seeing there is there's a group of people, hopefully a very small percentage, that need to be able to step on somebody. And this gives them an opening that wasn't obvious before. And you know, who's going to be next? Other thoughts?
I wanted to kind of bring up about the politics and love with dealing with politics. Sarah has heard me say this. I found myself in recent years of when I saw certain signs on cars, I immediately did not like them. As soon as I saw it, I didn't like it. I mean, it was, I don't know who they are. I don't know anything about them except I didn't like what I saw. And, you know, and I thought about, you know, that bothers me. It bothers me that I have such a preconceived notion of who these people are, that much less talk to them. I mean, I don't even know how I'd start the conversation. And I was listening to a podcast today that had nothing to do with that, but the woman in the podcast was talking about a guy that she ended up talking to who had a red cap that said "Make America Great Again," and she kind of made some kind of little, very small aside to say, you know, I think he's a certain kind of person. And he ended up being in this podcast. He ended up having some, you know, role. And he was so reasonable. He was so, I mean, I was sitting there going, this is terrible. And I am sitting here thinking he's going to be this idiot. And he's so reasonable and he spoke so well. And I kind of wanted to have a conversation with him, even though I had no opportunity to, obviously. But you know, it was my preconceived notions and then the shock of somebody that I thought, you know, I'll be interested to see where this goes, and realizes that, oh my gosh, you know, I could have a conversation with that guy if I was up to it.
Our neighbors have no idea what to make of us. We have a Black Lives Matter sign, a We Support the Police sign, and an American flag. And they have no idea what to make of us.
Absolutely, that makes sense.
Signals.
Sorry, Kathy?
I said you're sending mixed signals. Keep them on their toes.
I told my neighbor across the street not to worry. Come about November, I'm going to put a Duke and a Carolina sign up, and then we're really going to have fights.
Oh, no. That kind of made me think a little bit. I'm a
You have
little
to speak
bit.
up really loud.
I'm about a week behind, so I've only read the first 2 chapters, the introduction. But what you're talking about, I think he gave a little bit of an example of that in it was chapter 2, Finding Rituals of Comfort on page 39. He talks about the first funeral that he did, and for this man, Dwayne, who was killed in gang violence, and how he approached that, and how he had to change his language. He had to meet, because he looked out in the church, out into the pews, and that wasn't the normal congregants. It was real people that you don't see, with all of their stuff brought into that space. And he had to change how he spoke in the sermon and the homily, and he had to just bring it down from where we are to where they are, and maybe down's not the right word, but reaching across that divide, because and people in explaining what the ritual was in the act of communion, and pointing out that here's our rituals, but here's how their rituals were, and their rituals were different, and there was the rituals of violence and the rituals of the street. And that idea of learning and having that dialogue was part of that healing process for them. And in the end, people did come up for communion. That probably never did.
I think that line on page 41 that you're talking about is the saddest thing in the book, where he talks about the teenagers carrying the casket in and saying, "We'll see you real soon."
Because they don't have a life expectancy.
Yeah.
And that's so important, because if they don't have a life expectancy, how do things like education and a good job, how does that matter? If I'm going to be dead by the time I'm 22, what do I care what my profession is? It affects everything.
It affects the dream that you're talking
exactly.
about.
Yeah.
Brooke or Ginger, you wanna jump in with anything?
I've got a lot of thoughts, but if Ginger wants to go ahead. I don't care.
I was some years ago, I was put in a funny position. I went to Tennessee to teach a class for a week, and I had my cadaver dog with me, and somebody came in the first day I was there and asked if I would go to a church and find bodies in the cemetery, or find the graves, because when they knocked all the stones over, and they didn't know where the graves were anymore, and they just wanted to kind of put it back right. So I said, sure, I'd love to do that, and my dog is really good at that. And so on Wednesday, when I had to go, and I had started out with my dog, and there was nobody else there but me, and I was out behind this church, and I started working and flagging where the grave should be. And these 2 white guys came, and I'm white, and they looked at me and they said, hey lady, what are you doing? And I told them, and they said, but are you a Yankee? I said, no, I'm from North Carolina originally. And so they said, well, why are you doing this for a black church? And I said, oh, I didn't know churches came in black. And that sort of threw them off. But anyway, they just stood around and watched me. And they didn't say too much anymore. But then in a little while, here comes some more of their buddies. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm here by myself with these rednecks, and I grew up in redneck country. But I'm wearing a gun, and they don't know it. So
I'm tagging. Wow.
So then a whole group of people came, and one of them had a list of how that cemetery may have been laid out. It was an Episcopal American church, I think it's what it was called. Anyway, so I turned around to those guys. I said, well, some of these people out here could have been my relatives. And they said, you got black relatives? I said, no, I have Indian relatives. And because part of this cemetery has Indians in it, Quakers in it, missionaries, and black people. And they said, oh, well, why were they all buried together? And I said, if you go back in history, you'll find out that that was the way it was done. The Quakers or the Indians neither had monuments, or they had maybe wooden crosses. But over time, they just disappeared. But after a while, those guys stood around and watched this one white woman pulling up weeds and moving stuff around. And they joined in. And then the rector for that church came, and I thought he was going to faint. He almost turned white, he was just absolutely shocked. But they joined in, and I thought later, and I have thought about it a number of times, my life was not in danger, which I thought about that day. But I wonder how that might have changed any of their attitudes.
If nothing else, you may not even have planted a seed, but you did plow up the ground.
Yeah.
You at least did that much.
Yeah.
Yes.
And and I was glad I did it, and I'll do it again. But I know that one of my favorite priests from over the years said that you never know what you say to somebody that's going to affect them for the rest of their life. And I try to remember that. But I'm not sure about Michael's statement about the being around the people that weren't doing you any good. Or if I read that wrong or what. You mentioned it earlier.
I'm sorry, tell me again.
Bishop Curry said something about, or you said something about what he said earlier about being around people who are not good for you, or they're, caustic or whatever. And I'm not sure that I really understand that. Are we supposed to stay around them or not?
I think what his point was, we have to be careful not to be impacted by them, not to allow their nastiness to grow on us. And we certainly have no need to allow ourselves to be abused. I think that was kind of the key. If somebody's abusing us, we get out of the way. We get out of there. We don't, the nonviolence would say, we don't fight them we don't get equally nasty with them. Or the way my mother would phrase it, and she did on many occasions, I have no idea why. But anyway, she said, if you jump into the sewer to fight with somebody, you stink just as bad.
Yeah, this is true.
She must have been talking about my brothers.
That's good.
But didn't he also say that to pray for these people? Because there's something probably, and I may not be getting this from the book, earlier in their lives that makes them strike out at people. I have a situation with my sister-in-law, and I'll leave that at that, but she did have a hard life growing up. And I'm thinking that Bishop Curry was saying to love them, and I think it's kind of like a little nudge. I don't think he said it, but I thought it. The best way to get back at him is to kill him with kindness. Those were not his words, but be kind.
Yes.
Because they're expecting the other. They're expecting the other reaction.
Correct.
They're expecting a nasty reaction.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, and I found it very hard when people say, somebody's being nasty to me, and I'm told to, pray for them, and sometimes my prayers are probably not inappropriate for what I want God to do to them. But what I've discovered, is if I don't pray for something or even for them, and it's just me, this is my visualization, but rather just lift them into God's presence, You know, nothing else,
Mhm.
nothing else. Don't say anything. Just imagine presenting them to God, and not in a judgmental way, which is hard, but just that softens my attitude toward them.
Hey, Ken,
Yeah.
what do y'all think of when you hear about somebody's having problems and you ask if you can pray for them,
Mhm.
and they say no?
I would respect that. Personally, I would respect that.
But I feel like I should pray for them because if that's their attitude.
I just don't tell them that I'm gonna pray for them.
I would
I just,
You can pray.
anyway and just
Yeah.
not move it, because everyone is benefited by prayer.
I don't tell them that I'm gonna pray for them. I just do it.
Yeah,
All right.
I think some just don't want to be prayed for out loud in person, you know.
I mean,
It
I
makes
wouldn't do that. I mean, just pray for them, period.
Well, if you tell them you're Episcopalian, they won't expect you to pray out loud.
I'm not. She's moving, and it makes me. I'm doing the same thing. You know, one of the things when you're talking about that too much, that love on. Let's see what page is it. 88, where he said, a journalist said, "Sounds nice, but isn't a world built on love utopian, maybe a little Pollyanna-ish?" And he said, "Okay, let me do a Dr. Phil. How's that working for you?" And you know, he said, "We're living right now in a world built on selfishness, indifference, and even hatred, and it doesn't look good. What does it get us? Mass shootings, the murder of innocents, brutal dictatorship, suppression of ethnic and religious minority, mistreatment of refugees, the rise of racism, anti-Semitism, national nativism, and xenophobia." And it goes on, but you know, we talked about that a little bit this morning, but talking about Israel and Palestine and you know, and how, and even things done in our name, you can apply that same thing, evil done in our name. But doubling down on love, you know, it's like 2 doses of love instead of one. What would have happened on 9/11? What would that, if we had to fantasize and dream about what would it have looked like if we had responded with a double dose of love versus revenge? What if we responded the way Jesus would have had us respond versus the way we did? It's hard to imagine because all we're thinking is, hell no, you bombed our buildings, you used our own planes, you killed all these people, and we're not going to take it. We're going to show you we're not going to take it. And we all feel good about that. But would we feel good about going and saying, what caused you to direct so much hatred at us? Right. And if they said, well, you've destroyed our infrastructure. I don't know. I don't know all the history. What if we went in and we built more hospitals and we built more schools and we tried to find some reconciliation versus trying to show power? And I don't know. I'm just saying, when we go in with that different attitude, and you think about Palestine and Israel only being a country for such a short time, and United Nations and us mainly just put it there and said, y'all got to go. We helped set up that situation and done in our name, you know. I don't know, there's just so many situations I keep thinking about how, if we dreamed about or fantasized, how would Jesus respond to this? It wouldn't look like what we've done, but I'm not sure what it would look like. I don't know. Have y'all thought about that?
Well, those are two really big questions.
They are.
Yeah.
And two real different situations.
But they're still with violence. They're still.
Yeah, but
It goes back to the doormat thing a little bit too.
yeah, I mean, how the U.S. plays into those, plays into Palestine and Israel is a really tough
tough thing, and
Number one, not number two.
versus how they dealt with 9/11, saying, you know, fine, you did this to us, we'll show you, we'll come in with our power and we'll just bomb the hell out of y'all, and, you know, take away all the people that, you know, are gonna cause any problems. And I see those.
See, I see Palestine, you know, they fired at Israel, and so we're gonna show you. And
Yeah, but how do we play into that? I'm
well,
serious.
we pay for everything.
Yeah.
We pay for the missile destroyers. We set up the situation to begin with.
Well,
We created the country. You know, Israel wasn't a country. You know, we created that country, and stuck it right down in the middle of Palestine and said, y'all get out.
well, that was their.
We
that was
bought the
their-
bombs and shipped them to them that are now being
Yeah, I
sold.
know, yeah. But it wasn't there. They never had a country. They had the tribe of Israel, but they never had a country.
Let's back up just a second. Let me back up just a second,
That's
because
a whole different
I think the first question or the first statement Sarah made is the most important one, which is to ask, can we imagine a different solution? Can we imagine a different, you know, not what it should be, but can we imagine it? And now I think you can take Curry's comment, go even further, in the sense that we've been in Afghanistan for what is now 22 years and made any difference in the positive way. You know, so what would, you know, and I'm not suggesting we answer this today. I think it's a thought process. What would happen if we approach these things from a different direction? That's a lot of what's going on with the police reform in our country. What would happen if, when the call came in of a man mentally unstable, we didn't send armed officers out first? They probably need to be available, but if we sent a mental health person out first and treated that person not as a threat unless he shows he is, but instead of treating him immediately as a threat, we treat him as a person in need. How that changes the interaction and what goes on if we change the language, you know, we change the situation. And you know, I think Sarah's right on. The question is not what can we do, and back to Curry's fantasy issue, is there something we could look at that would be a different approach? You know, and believe me, I don't have the answer in Israel, Palestine. That's one of many where I say, you make me czar of the world, and I wouldn't know what to do.
Well, and
That one is so complicated.
that struggle has been going on since before Christ.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, the fun thing is the Palestinians point out they were there before the Jews. The Jews came into their land, according to the scripture. So, and I don't know what you do with that. I mean, that was what, 4,000 years ago?
Correct.
So, well, 3.5. No. But I think the image is what we're talking about, is it's changing our thought process to begin by thinking, in his words, reconciliation and justice first, and violence second, or maybe third or fourth or fifth. And there are cases when the police need to come in with force, no doubt about it. But there are lots of cases where that doesn't need to be the first thing. And I think that's the change in thinking Curry suggested.
But how do you get the people in charge to think like this?
I think we're back to things done in our name. I think we have to insist it happens. And if, you know, look what's going on, and I'm not picking on anybody here, but look what's going on in the Republican Party, where a relatively small section of people is basically running the party. You know, the same thing, I think, is if a relatively small number of people get active locally, that will change things. You know, because frankly, you know, if 10% of the population is out there talking to their elected officials, that's a lot of people. I worked in local government for 20 years, and you get 10 or, you know, I can remember one zoning case. The alderman stood up and he said, I got 17 phone calls, 9 one way, 8 the other, so I'm voting this way. I mean, you know, getting a significant number of people out there talking. And I think the other part of it is the listening part he talked about. Spending, you know, he talked about his and I had to skip right over this, but if you haven't noticed it, reread the section on what they did in Baltimore. And he spent, I think I remember right, 2 years listening and then designing a response. And I think in a lot of these cases, that's important. I think, you know, I'd sit down and talk to some patrol officers and say, come on, guys, tell me exactly what it's like. And I think we'd find most of the patrol officers want to do a good job for the people and would appreciate our support. But the same thing, sit down with some of the mental health people and say, okay, you've heard something, what should happen? How should these be handled? You know, and you know, or even when it's not mental health, somebody gets stopped for a traffic violation. What's, you know, in Forsyth and Guilford counties, the sheriff has ended high-speed chases. He said they're too dangerous. They're too likely to cause danger, cause pain, than they are likely to stop it. And he said, our job is to stop bad things, not cause bad things. Those are my words, not his or hers. You know, so, you know, other times we need to look at our reactions. But that, anyway, I'm talking too much.
Well, yeah, I think that's interesting. Plato once said that the wisest man knows that he knows nothing at all.
Yeah.
And growing up, I met with a missionary once, and she was doing work in somewhere in Africa, Central Africa, probably Congo area. And when they were planning their mission work before they went to live with these people for months or long-term mission work, she and her group had an idea of what the need was in the community that they were going to serve. And they believed that the need was disease, malaria, say flu, sleeping sickness, and food insecurity. But they got there, and when they got there and lived with people, those weren't the issues that they were worried about.
Right.
They wanted water that was clean. They didn't have to fight alligators to get to, and they wanted their women were being raped in the fields when they go out in the fields. So those were the new issues, and so realizing all this baggage, all this that I carry with me, I got to put that down.
Uh-huh.
Kind of like what Ann was saying, the bishop. You can't get somebody else up. You just gotta sit with them while they're there until they're ready to get up. And that's all you can do, really.
Yeah.
And it's just like the work in Baltimore, you have to, you know, in anthropology, that was when I started college. We learned about when people would go to this thing called the gaze, G-A-Z-E, and it's critical religious theory. And the idea is people would go to Hawaii, the tourists would go to Hawaii, and they were so excited to see the native Hawaiians and the hula skirts. And that's called the tourist gaze. It's this lens, it's like the beer goggles. You don't see for what it really is, you only see what you are thinking you're seeing. Right. And so that's that idea of what are the stories, learning those stories. That's because everything is narrative.
Right.
So yeah.
And you know, I think that's where when I think of police violence and changing that, if we all have preconceived, culturally influenced thoughts about blacks versus whites, because we do, whether we like it or not, it's there. The police are part of that culture.
Yeah.
They have the same things, and you can't just, when you're in a tense situation and there's fear of the unknown sometimes introduced into that, that culturally influenced things in your subconscious is going to be there, you know, and so some of that has to change, you know, and you know, when I think about the solutions, like I think it's page 11, a solution that works for everyone, and trying to help people think that by lifting up Black people, it also lifts us up. You know, that somebody doesn't have to have power. Lifting up Asians helps lift everybody up. Whenever we're helping someone, it's helping everybody, not just them. It helps us too. And
It's that Ubuntu. that you
Ubuntu.
talked about, I am because we are.
Right,
Yeah. It's you are not a you, it's we are an us.
right.
Yeah.
We are an us.
Mhm.
And to stop thinking about we are an us or as Episcopalians, or we're an us as white people,
Right.
or we are an us as, you know.
Ken, I know it's
Sarah,
posted.
I think one of the
Sorry.
bigger challenges are the people who say, well, I have a couple Black friends, therefore I'm not racist. Because back to what we talked about earlier, they know those people as people. The rest of the Blacks or homosexuals or whatever are its. They're just it. They're not people.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, helping people to understand it's not about having a friend. That doesn't change your attitude necessarily. It's about changing your attitude.
Yeah, Ken, I know we're close to ending, but I wanted to say that one of the things that I think you said tonight that really resonated with me, it's a twofold piece. One is I've struggled so much and do not speak to, as you were saying earlier, to individuals who are opposed to what I'm thinking, because generally the majority of those individuals are so loud and so angry and so pushing their agenda on me that what I do is just go, and then I feel like a hypocrite because I'm not sharing in a kind way. I could do it in a kind way, but I choose not to share to avoid the conflict. And so what I love that you imparted on me tonight is to say, I believe what Jesus would want us to do is. I have never thought of saying that, other than I might have said, I think with you and Brooke one time in one of our meetings,
Right.
that sometimes it frustrates me that the Christian right is saying, has the white Jesus on the wall and says Jews will not replace us and all these things, and they forget that Jesus was a Jew and he certainly wasn't white. And it's so frustrating for me to say, what part do you, kind of not get in this picture? So that has helped me tonight because now I might be able to find my voice. And I think I have not been able to find that because I've been frightened and I want to avoid conflict. So that has been very helpful. The other thing, we're a small town here. Maybe this might not work in Forsyth, maybe it might not work in Guilford, but it might, because you said take something, and if one person does a little small seed. In this community, our chief of police has a wonderful class, an unbelievable class that you take for maybe 12 weeks, once a week, and learning about what the police do and hearing their stories. And they bring in all the different officers that are over this or over that, and then you do a ride along.
Mm-hmm.
So for 8 hours, I did a ride along that was incredibly eye-opening and frightening. And it was, really a bit challenging for me in my comfort zone. But I saw the compassion, and you could have said they were just doing it. No, in an intense moment, I think they were being who they are.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that, and that gave me a lot of sense of, they really are there for a lot of the right reasons. There's always people in all of life. I mean, I'm in the healthcare profession. There's always people that don't do it right. But as a whole, so maybe that's something that our police chief could share with others and do something like that.
There's a lot of places that do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, and
Right.
back to
It's
the
really good.
back to your comment about saying what would I believe Jesus. One of the things to watch for if you're in a conversation, listen for a point of agreement. Let them talk for a while, and you'll probably get somewhere where you're close anyway. And even if it's just saying, I believe Jesus wants us to treat everybody well, some kind of broad statement like that. I find what I want to do is I want to attack their main point. I want to jump on them and beat them. And okay, I'll win, but that really doesn't accomplish anything positive. But if so it's helpful to look.
Yeah, we're looking for reconciliation.
Yeah.
Well, I tell people, and this is true, after Charlestown, after the riots up there, I deliberately looked at some of the websites of some of the groups and looked at their manifestos and stuff. And buried deep in them, and this isn't the exact words, but was the thought, this economy is not working for many people. All right, we have a point there to begin a discussion, because I agree with them. If I, and again, like you were saying, probably 90% of them wouldn't allow a discussion. But if I was with somebody and I said that, there's a chance the discussion, we'd have an opportunity not to avoid war. We may not get to unity, but we may take a small step in that direction. So that'd be the one thing I'd offer is to also look for something you're not too far apart on. If you find that, work from there. And again, the other thing is, my approach on politics and preaching and religion is when I'm preaching, I consider the difference being the scripture is the goal, the fantasy. Everybody should have good medical care. Politics is how you get that accomplished. I don't know how to get that accomplished. So I will preach the goal. I will preach what I think the gospel says. But I'm not going to argue. So if I'm with somebody, I can say the goal is for everybody to have medical care. Let's talk about how that might happen.
Yes.
And we are past our agreed upon time. I'm perfectly willing to continue, but I want to give everybody the right to leave if they need to.